Welcome to my top standard decks for week 10 of Wilds of Eldraine. We are just about to go into the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, so we'll see how that shakes up the meta. But for the time being, I had to take last weekend off to do my set review for the Lost Caverns, and there's over 12 hours of video on YouTube if that's what you want to see. But so to catch up on things, we're gonna have to rewind a little bit, right? And so one of the things that I use to kind of monitor how the best of 3 meta is doing in Standard is the Standard Challenge on Moto. And I always like to look at like the first place or second place winners, and for both the November 4th and November 5th, Golgari Midrange by Tzio and Soon both placed first place. And if we go back in time and compare this to the list that I showcased on week 6, almost a month ago, there have been some changes, but not too many. So they both decided to, by the way, they both ran the same list. So they both decided to cut one Go for the Throat, wrong card, and take this one down to 3 copies instead of 4. And they decided to put in an Anoint with Affliction, which I thought was really interesting, because there aren't any other, there's no like corrupted synergies, but this exiles the creature instead of just destroys it. So it's a kind of a nice answer if you have a recurring threat, like if you're in the mirror match against the Mosswood Dread Knight, you can just get rid of it, right? So I think that's why they brought in the Anoint Affliction, and I think that's a pretty decent addition. It also gets rid of the recurring, the 3/1, I'm blanking on the name, but you know, it gets cheaper with how many lands are in play. You don't see that one a whole lot outside of, like, inside the main, though. So I think that's really just a tech against Mosswood Dread Knight. And then we're cutting down 1 copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse, which I thought was interesting, and I think the game doesn't need it, or the deck doesn't need it. It's pretty good, but we've got a lot of mid-range threats that Shieldred is just kind of like icing on top. So drop that one down to 2. And then we're mainboarding 3 copies of Tranquil Frillback, which generally is a sideboard inclusion that you bring in, but they both felt that there was going to be enough matchups where this was going to have relevant targets. And, you know, it's got a pretty good versatility to it. You can use it to get rid of virtues. You can use it to exile your target player's graveyard if you've got graveyard recursion problems. And then you can just use it to gain 4 life. So I think that, you know, if you were expecting to come up against more of an aggro deck, which in best of 3 isn't as common as in best of 1, but it's still an interesting inclusion in the main. And notably, they got rid of the graveyard trespassers. Since this can kind of hate on the graveyard, fills kind of a similar spot, gives you that 4 life, and kind of helps stabilize you. So I think that's a good inclusion over the graveyard trespassers. And then because it is best of 3, we like to go over the sideboard really quickly. So we do have Duress, Liliana the Veil, Nightclubber, Path of Peril, Phyrexian Arena, cut down a 2nd copy of Anoint with Affliction, Pilfer, the 4th copy of the Tranquil Frillback, The End. If you come up against like Azorius Control, this is particularly nice if they only have a few number of threats in their deck. And then Gix's Command if you're coming up against those wide boards. So since I missed the previous week, this one's from the 28th of October, and this was a first place list by Azorius Soldiers by Victor Carvel Poo 01. So this one is, we've seen Azorius Soldiers doing very well, right? And so I'm not surprised to see Azorius Soldiers placing first place again. I think that, like, it's definitely one of the top best of 3 decks. And this one I covered a couple of weeks ago, and if we compare it to the list that Falcon was running, we have only a couple of changes, right? So we've decided to go. They've decided to up the count of Werefox Bodyguard from 2 to 4, and to take out the 2 cards that they're deciding to sub out are the 2 Regal Bunnycorns. And the Bunnycorns, I think, I've seen a couple of lists kind of take them out and then put them back in, and take them out and put them back in, and the deck doesn't really need it as a win condition. Like, when you get Harbin online and you're able to just send all of your soldiers in as flyers, you don't really need that Bunnicorn to be just a really big threat. So I think that's a decent substitution. And the sideboard, since it is best of 3, we've got Elspeth's Smite, Destroy Evil, Lantern Flare, the Wandering Emperor, Protect the Negotiators, and Tokashia's Welcome. And this is the other list that placed first place on the 29th, is also Azorius Soldiers, this time by Thaism. And we've covered Thaism several times, so they have just been absolutely crushing the standard challenge over on Moto. And although there have been a couple of changes over time, so we can see that they've decided to include 2 Fairy Masterminds, or punishing our opponent's card draw, and then if down 2 copies of the Werefox Bodyguard compared to the previous list. A lot of them are still just running 2, and so you'll see which one's the winner. Although the meta is about to shift, so we'll see. But we decided to cut the 1 copy of the Protect the Negotiators, the counterspell that counters for however many creatures you have on board with the white kicker. And in place of that, we have decided to run 1 copy of Virtue of Loyalty. And this is another one that we've seen kind of come and go throughout the weeks. I think it's pretty good as a one-of. You're not really going to catch people off guard with the 2/2 Knight trick as often as you were near the beginning of the meta. But, there are some times where you can't really get your Harbin win condition, and so being able to just pump your board and become too big to answer is definitely a good win condition to include. And then similarly, the best of 3 sideboard, we have Destroy Evil, Lantern Flare, Lauren of the Third Path, which I thought was an interesting inclusion if you're really coming up against enchantments, and Selesnya enchantments pops up here and there. Another copy of Werefox Bodyguard, the Wandering Emperor, Protect the Negotiators, 4 copies, and then 2 copies of Tokashia's Welcome. So that does it for the standard challenge winners and the tournament winners, but I also like to showcase decks that caught my attention that recently hit Mythic. And this one is a Bant Midrange deck by Borges, and recently hit Mythic this season, and is kind of a refreshing take, because it's largely based on other decks, but has some interesting things going on. So this one, we've got our Lunarch, a Veteran, similar to the mono white build, very handy if you're getting pressured by the mono red or any form of aggression. We've got the 2 copies of Intrepid Adversary, and so there's kind of a life gain sub theme going on in this deck. And then we've got Shauna, Purifying Blade, and this is kind of the upside to having so much life gain, is that at the beginning of your end step, if you may pay X. And if you do, you draw X, and X can't be greater than the amount of life you gained this turn. So we're trying to play off of Shauna's the core, right? And the reason why we're deciding to splash green for Bant. And so we're running some lifelink sources to be able to increase our card draw off of that. And then we've also got Elish Norn, which I thought was interesting. We've seen this one here and there, but never really in a top competitive deck. And it's you got a 3/5 vigilance for 2 double pip white, which is a pretty decent stat. And whenever a source an opponent controls deals damage to you, or a permanent you control, that source's controller loses 2 life, unless they pay 1. And then you can sacrifice 3 other creatures, which this is kind of like a mono white is very good at creating a mass of creatures to sacrifice, right? And then when Elish Norn flips, it's basically game over, right? You incubate 2 5 times, and then transform all of your incubator tokens, and then the next turn all of your creatures get +1/+1 and double strike. So if you don't win by attacking with 5 3/3 double strikers, then at the end it destroys all other permanents except for artifacts, lands, and Phyrexians, which should do the trick. So an interesting win condition here. And Steel Seraph for more of the life gain synergies. Started to see Steel Seraph popping up in other lists as well. It is best of 3. It's a best of 3 list, so Wedding Announcement is a great mid-range threat. It's a little bit slow if you're in best of 1 and you're trying to do the aggro thing, but the Anthem creates 2 bodies, draws cards. This is just an amazing card. If if you have the time to let it actually get to completion. And then we have 4 copies of Virtue of Loyalty, so really leaning into this as one of our win conditions. We've got the 4 Make Disappears to protect against the Sunfalls in Domain and make sure our board doesn't just get completely wiped. We've got the Destroy Evils, which I think is particularly nice when you're up against the Esper Legends and you can just like nuke Rafine with the Destroy Evil, or if you're in the mirror match and you need to kill a Wedding Announcement or Virtue of Loyalty. And then we've got 3 copies of Wandering Emperor as just a good way to build our board, create a 2/2, give something a +1/+1 token and life or first strike, sorry. And then, you know, also as removal. So all around, Wandering Emperor is great in kind of a mid-range strategy. And then best of 3, they decided to create include 2 Elspeth Smite, a Disdainful Stroke, Lauren of the Third Path, 1 more copy of Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, the Eternal Wanderer. I'm not really sure which matchup you were going to specifically want to do this, but if you're interested in a board wipe, right, then this becomes quite interesting. We've got another copy of Destroy Evil, the Invasion of Gobakon for a little bit of hand hate, Sunset Revelry, so really being able to pump the brakes if we are up against aggro, and then another copy of Disdainful Stroke, and 2 copies of Sunfall. And similarly, I don't like to just keep it best of 3. I try to at least include some best of 1 because it's the format that I play the most. And so this one was another one that caught my list. It was a mythic list by Teagen. And this one is Selesnya Humans. So mono-white humans, but with a slightly different take. And so this one is notably all creatures. There are no spells in this deck. It is a completely creature-heavy deck, right? We've got 4 copies of Recruitment Officer. We've got the Hopeful Initiate from white as well. We've got the Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. And but then we start, you know, why are we Selesnya? And one of the answers is Catilda, the Dawnheart Prime. Human creatures you control become mana sources, and it has protection from werewolves, which isn't terribly relevant, but sometimes can dodge like getting hit by a Brutal Cathar. And then it has 4 colorless, a green and a white. Tap, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So we're kind of like, hey, all right, let's Virtue of Loyalty at home, right? And so we kind of got this board flood strategy, and then a couple of other green cards that are worth noting as well. One of which is the Hamlet Vanguard, which is a 1/1 Ward 2 for 3. When it enters the battlefield, 2 +1/+1 counters on it for each other non-token human you control. So this can enter just for an absolutely huge number because you're really good at creating a whole bunch of little tiny 1/1 humans, right? 1-cost humans. And then we've got the Tauren's Fist of the Angels, which is a 2/2 with training. And whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 human soldier token with training. So these synergize quite nicely with each other. And then we've also, Adeline is able to flood the board with even more 1/1 tokens. And then we've got the Knight Errant of Eos to help us dig for our late game threats. So it's cool to see that there's still some innovative solutions happening in best of 1, and I definitely am curious about how this deck will perform on the ladder. And the other source that I really look to a lot to kind of figure out what's going on in the meta is Untapped, and this one was the top performing archetype and deck. And if we, Mono White Humans has been great. There's kind of a rock, paper, scissors that's going on in best of 1 right now, where Mono Red is very prevalent, and then Mono White is kind of its natural counter, and then Azorius Soldiers is good against Mono White Humans. So because there's so much Mono Red, I think Mono White is probably the deck that I tend to play the most. Just because you're trying to counter the matchup that you come up against the most, and then its spread against the field is relatively it's pretty decent. But if we compare this one to the one that I covered in week 8, we have seen some changes. One of which I thought was very interesting is that they decided to, the mighty algorithm, right? The top performing deck is only running 1 Hopeful Initiate, and so this is down from 4 copies. And honestly, playing with Mono White, I have felt that Hopeful Initiate has been a little bit of an underperformer. There's not a whole lot of times where you're actually using the remove the 2 counters to destroy an enchantment. The pace of the set is just incredibly fast, and there's a lot of disruption where, you know, a lot of times I'd just rather play the recruitment officer and try to get in for 2 damage instead of grow the helpful initiate. So I felt like that was a decent change. We've also got the 4 copies of the Lunarch Veteran, and this is kind of like leaning into the tech that we saw first in Best of 3 with the Azorius Soldiers, and this seems like a pretty good inclusion to even increase the win rate against mono red further. And then we've got Skrelv up to 3 from 1. I think Skrelv is particularly nice when you're up against like Domain and you're trying to dodge your opponent's removal so that you can pressure before the Sunfall just ends all of your hopes and dreams. And it's pretty good against mono red too, just to protect against the shock and the lightning bolt. And then we've got the Spellbook Vendor, and we've seen the Spellbook Vendor pop in and out from the beginning of Wilds of Eldraine. Notably in this list, no Extraction Specialist, so we're not leaning into trying to bring back Spellbook Vendor or Thalia or Coppercoat Vanguard, but just playing it outright, just even without the specialist synergies. And bumped up the Adeline to 4, and I really like this, especially against mono red. Mono red, because outside of Witchstalker's Frenzy, can kind of struggle with the 4 toughness. So this one I feel like is just really leaning into hating on the mono red. And notably, we're down 4 copies of the Anointed Peacekeeper, which is better against the control and like Domain Ramp, which sometimes gets called 4-color control. And so we're kind of accepting our fate here, that we're a little bit worse against Sunfall. But hopefully we can get that enough aggro in that we can win before our opponent's Sunfalls. And then notably, 2 copies of the Guardian of New Benalia have been removed. And if we're teching kind of harder against mono red, by including Lunarch Veteran and the 4th copy of Adeline and things like that, it's possible that the Guardian of New Benalia just wasn't necessary, because where I've found that one to be the most useful is against mono red, and then other matchups it's not as great. So and then same mana base seem to have settled on 1 Gonjo and 1 Mishra's Foundry to get a last little bit of damage in if we were just barely shy after the Sunfall. The second top performing deck on Untapped in Best of 1 was Mono Red Aggro, and this one is hard to say what the perfect build is, right? And there's so many people running different slight variations of Mono Red that I'd be really curious to see what the computer scientists say, looking at the data. But this one is running, if we compare this one to what I covered in week 8 before I took the break to cover the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we see a couple of changes. One is leaning fully into the Monstrous Rage, making it very punishing if our opponents do decide to block, and running 4 copies of the Phoenix Chick instead of just 2. And I've seen these cards kind of come and go, fluctuate a little bit. Squee, we're running 4 copies of Squee instead of just 3, and similarly 4 copies of Godric, which I like because the chances of you having the double legendary that you can't play, the games are so short, it's not that big of a deal, and these things have such a high target on them that your opponent is likely to remove them. And but what I did notice is this one is not running any copies of Charming Scoundrel. So a lot of lists have been playing Charming Scoundrel because it single-handedly triggers Godric, but this deck doesn't really have a problem triggering Godric, because if you play it on turn 3 off of turn 1 Kumano, it's already got Celebration. Monstrous Rage triggers Celebration in and of itself, and Squee triggers the Celebration as well. So I think that the removing the Charming Scoundrel feels okay to me. I like that idea. And then this one isn't leaning into any of the dragon synergies off of Godric, because Godric gives all dragons fire breathing, so some lists have decided to play like Shivan Devastator, and this one does not. And also notably, no copies of Witchstalker Frenzy. And throughout the weeks, I was expecting there to be a list that was running the Witchstalker Frenzies, and they just really haven't come up. And the more that I think about it, it kind of makes sense, because the best target we were all thinking at the beginning, right, was Shieldred, and you want to see Shieldred being played less and less, and especially in best of 1, because it's just such a fast pace. So we've seen Strangle around in a couple of lists, and it never makes it into the top performing archetypes. And so if Witchstalker Frenzy is going to play a lot like Strangle, where you're just hitting a 3 toughness creature, then it's not that important to include. And the Monstrous Rage gives us an answer to the 4 toughness, probably better than actually trying to shoot it because of Skrelv. We just go over the top if they do decide to block. So very interested. This is another one that I think I'll definitely be throwing some matches at before Wilds of Eldraine is over. And last but not least is the mono red burn list. And so I decided to skip the third, because the third performing one on Untapped was Selesnya Enchantments, and it is the exact same list that I covered in week 7. So if you want to jam some Selesnya Enchantments, check out that one. Check out that video. And but this one we've seen, and I think mono red burn might actually be better positioned to take advantage over some of the cards in the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And so very curious to see if mono red burn becomes the favorable build over the mono red aggro. And what really separates them out is playing cards like Voldaren Epicure, so that you can filter your draws off of the blood tokens. You've got 3 copies of Feldon instead of 2. We've got 1 less copy of Squee. No copies of Godric, so less creature centric, focusing more on just getting damage in where we can, and then trying to finish off with direct damage from spells. And we've got In the Festivities, which works really nicely to slow down our opponent's board. And I think this build is a little bit better against mono white because of this card. And we've got 2 Reckless Impulse. So between the dig from Epicure and Reckless Impulse, you can kind of see it's taking a different path, and why it's called Burn instead of Aggro. And to make sure that we actually have enough reach to deal direct damage to our opponent and kill them, we've got Mechanized Warfare. And this one can be a little bit awkward, right? Sometimes you're playing against a race, and then you're playing Mechanized Warfare, and you have to have gas to make it back up. And if you're leaning into the Reckless Impulse, it can kind of become a little bit awkward. But we've got no copies of Monstrous Rage, because we are running fewer creatures, and we might not have a good target for it. No copies of Bloodthirsty Adversary, and notably, though, less land, because we have the card draw, right? We're able to really abuse the best of 1 Hand Smoother and go all the way, drop 1 mountain as well as 1 Sokenzon. Because we don't have Godric, we don't need to worry about the Celebration trigger, and run just 20 lands. So I hope you enjoyed my breakdown of my my favorite standard decks. Remember to hit like and subscribe for more near daily Magic the Gathering content. I'm still working on hitting that magic metric. And thank you, everybody. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and are ready to see how the meta changes with the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Take care.